Well, this morning I'm beginning a brand new series entitled Upside Down Blessings, and what we're going to be looking at is the Beatitudes. Now, the Beatitudes are actually the preamble to the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, by far and away the greatest sermon ever preached, but not only the greatest, I say the most radical. That was where Jesus told us stuff like this, to turn the other cheek and go the extra mile, and to, love your enemies and to do good to those who hate you. This is pretty radical stuff. It's actually completely upside down, completely contrary to human nature. And he begins, and it's important, and I don't want you to miss it, it begins with the Beatitudes, because there's a big difference between the Beatitudes and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Because the Sermon on the Mount is about conduct. It's about how we are to live our Christian life. But the Beatitudes is about character. And you see, here's how it works. You will never be able to fulfill the conduct of the Sermon on the Mount if you don't obtain and embody the character of the Beatitudes. Because you can never really act anywhere, anytime, or any way that's inconsistent with your character. See, what we do ultimately comes out of who we are. And you're not going to be able to do the Sermon on the Mount if you aren't being or are the Beatitudes. And so here's the good news on it. If we can begin to learn the character of the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount becomes a piece of cake. It just becomes a natural outworking of it. But without the Beatitudes, we're in desperate trouble. There's a story, you've maybe heard it before, about this Irish boxing champ. And after his boxing career was over, he became a street preacher, and he was as fiery on the streets preaching as he was in the ring boxing. One day he had a crowd of people on the streets of Ireland, and he was preaching the gospel, and he was going at it, and there was an inebriated man that came up, was offended by what he said, and goes over and sucker punches him right in the face. He reels for a moment, and then he turns to the man, and he said, "Jesus said to turn the other cheek, so give me another shot." So he wailed off, hit him again. This time he got up and he proceeded to beat the living tar out of this guy. The audience, the group of people that had gathered in the street, where they were completely aghast and their jaws were on the ground. And he turned to the audience and he said this. He said, "Jesus said, turn the other cheek." After that, he gave no further instructions. Well, today we're going to find out that he actually does give further instructions. And so if you have a Bible with you, we are in Matthew chapter 5. We're going to throw it up on the screen. We're going to look at the Beatitudes, like I said, the preamble of the Sermon on the Mount. We're starting in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1, and it says this. "And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.'" This just gets better and better, right? I mean, it starts off with being poor and ends up with rejoicing, being exceedingly glad that you're being persecuted, that you are being reviled, and people are saying all kinds of evil against you. There's something going on here that we need to figure out. First of all, let me say this. Jesus had this MO, this modus operandi. And whenever he gathered a crowd and whenever he was sort of at the height of ministry, have you noticed what he did? He often would say something that would completely offend everybody and send them all packing. Remember the other time when he said this, "Unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you cannot be my disciple"? What did everybody do? They all left, and only the 12 stayed. And he said, "Are you going to leave too?" He said, "No, well, if you want us to do..." Totally misunderstood what he was saying. So here we have this story where he's in the region of Galilee, and he's healing the sick, and he's raising the dead, and he's cleansing the lepers, and he's meeting these people's needs. And here he is, he's at this moment where he's got this huge crowd, and here he does it again, and he drops this bombshell on them, and he offends them. It's sort of interesting to me. What Jesus did was he lured them in with what they thought they needed, and then he gave them what they really needed, right? He lured them in with cake and ice cream, and then he followed up with broccoli and cauliflower. This is the way I read this story. That's not what we do in the church today. What do we do in the church today? We lure people in with cake and ice cream, and then we follow it up with whipped cream and a cherry on top. And we have this light and fluffy Christianity, this bowl of cherries that we offer to people, and we haven't really wrestled with the hard sayings of Jesus. This is what Tony Campolo said about it. Look at this. He said, if we were to set out to establish a religion in polar opposition to the Beatitudes Jesus taught, it would look strikingly similar to the pop Christianity that has taken over the airwaves of North America. Ouch! As a televangelist, I resemble that remark, right? But we should really be indicted by it, because what have we done with Christianity? Does it really look like the Beatitudes? So what we're going to do today is we're going to begin our journey to discover and find out and unpack the Beatitudes and find out what they're really all about. First thing we need to know is this, that the Beatitudes is actually not a biblical word. It's the Latin word for blessings. And it's just what we call these. These are these blessings, these upside-down blessings. And the word blessing here, blessed are, that he uses 9 different times, it's the word makarios. Because we're probably wondering, I want to be happy, but there's nothing in this passage that actually makes me happy. Have you noticed that? There's nothing here that would make you happy. Are you happy when you are poor? Are you happy when people insult you? Are you happy when you are persecuted? How can you be happy when you're mourning? That's a contradiction of terms. So then we think, well, maybe it doesn't mean happy, because that's what the word makarios means, but maybe he means something else. Well, you go and study it, and the word happy here, you know what it means? Happy. That's what it means. And if you go study it in, let's say, the Old Testament, the Greek Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, you find that same word in kind of obvious places. It says, blessed is he who finds wisdom in Proverbs. It says, blessed is the nation, or happy is the man whose nation is the Lord. It says, happy is the man whose quiver is full, meaning having a lot of children. And so, in fact, it actually does say happy. So now we're struggling with this, so we're scratching our head, and how can these things make us happy? Well, maybe we need to redefine happiness. You can do that, right? I mean, those of you that are married, as soon as you got married, you redefined happiness. Did you know that? I have learned the secret to a happy marriage. Do you want to know what it is? I don't try to run Kathy's life, and I don't try to run mine. It's perfect. Here's my advice to you. If you want to be happy, ladies, if you want to be happy with your husbands, you need to love them a little and understand them a lot. And husbands, if you want to be happy with your wives, you need to love them a lot and don't even try to understand them. Because that is a lost cause. There's this story, it's an old joke, you've probably heard it, and this man is walking along the beach of California, and he kicks up the proverbial Aladdin's lamp, rubs the lamp, and this genie comes out. The genie says, I will grant you 1 wish. He says, 1 wish? I thought I'd get 3 wishes. He says, look, I'm new. I'm giving you 1 wish. Don't make it too hard, because like I said, I'm new. He says, well, I'm standing here looking over the ocean, and I know Hawaii's on the other side, and I've never been to Hawaii, and I always want to go to Hawaii, but I can't go there because I'm afraid of flying. And so my wish was that you would build me a bridge from here to Hawaii so I could drive my car. And the genie says, come on. Don't you expect me to do that? Do you have something else you would rather have? He says, well, I've always wanted to understand women. To which the genie said, would that be a 2-lane or a 4-lane bridge? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this thing called the first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so when we look at it, it doesn't really make sense. Why do we have to be poor, or why do we have to be poor in spirit? What does this all mean? And see, here's what Jesus did. It's sort of fascinating to me. He never actually explained the Beatitudes. Did you notice that? He just said them. He just listed them. Boom, boom, boom. No commentary, no explanation. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to dig a little deeper to figure out what he's actually talking about. And so what is it about the poor? You have to think this through. What is it about the poor that would appeal to God? And see, there is something that the poor have that the rich don't have that appeals immensely to God. Who can tell me what that one thing would be? What do the poor have that the rich don't have? Humility. I heard it. Humility. You see, that's the essence of this. It's all about humility. It's not about whether you're rich or poor. It's about whether you obtain and have this thing called humility that poor people have. You see, Jesus told a story one time to his disciples, freaked them right out. And he said it would be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter heaven. Do you remember that? And it says the disciples were astonished beyond measure, meaning they were completely freaked out by this. Why? Because they knew the Old Testament patriarchs, people like Abraham and Solomon and Job, were immensely rich. And so all of a sudden they're saying, well, then who then can be saved? And Jesus said, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And you see, the thing we have to understand is that when Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, he's actually not talking about the rich and the poor. What he is talking about is the attitude of the rich and the poor. And what we're talking about in this message this morning is the attitudes of the Beatitudes. And there is a certain attitude in the poor that Jesus wants us to have, and we already heard it, and that thing is humility. And when we begin to, if we're going to go on this journey to discover who God is, we're going to have to discover this thing called humility. Now, I'm going to help you with this. I think there's one verse that really helps us understand the spirit of the poor, and it's in Proverbs 18:23, and here it is. And it says this, the rich man answers roughly, but the poor begs for mercy. If you think about that, is that true? See, the rich man, he has everything. He doesn't need anything from anybody else. And so he can answer abruptly. He can answer roughly. He can be brash and harsh with other people. The poor man cannot. The poor man has to have humility because he doesn't have the wherewithal. He doesn't have the self-reliance and the independence. And so if he wants something in this world, he has to beg for it. And the scripture says here that the rich man, he just answers roughly, but the poor man begs for mercy. And there's a backstory to that verse that I think Solomon, when he wrote it, probably had in mind. And it had to do with an encounter his father had. And if his father never told him this story growing up, he would have at least read it in the scripture, because it's in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And we have David and his men, and they're running from Saul, and he's got this ragtag army, and they're in this region where there was a very wealthy man lived, and this man's name was Nabal. And Nabal had thousands of goats and sheep, and he was very wealthy, but he was known for being, and it actually says this, one who speaks harshly with others. And in fact, it actually describes him as a scoundrel. And so David was in this region, and David was protecting the region, and actually had people in his group that were from Nabal's household. And so he comes up with this idea, because they're running low on provisions, to send a team of men to go to Nabal, because he was shearing his sheep, so it would be a good time for them to slaughter some of those sheep and maybe provide some provision for David and his men. I mean, David, after all, was protecting them and protecting that region. And so his men went to Nabal, and they asked him, they entreated him and said, would you provide some provisions? And it says that Nabal, it actually uses these words, it says, and Nabal answered harshly. And he said, who is this David that you speak of? I don't know this man. Why should I do anything for him or anybody that I do not know? And he insults David, and he sends these men off empty-handed. When they get to David, David, of course, is really put out and says, okay, we'll do it another way. And we will arm ourselves, and we will attack Nabal, and we will take what we need from him. And so his intention was to go in and actually to kill Nabal and to kill all the men in his household. Well, that message of what was going to happen got back to Nabal's household, particularly one of the servants. And the servant told Nabal's wife, whose name was Abigail. And Abigail knew she needed to act and to do something. And so what she did was she secretly went and took provisions and took meat and took provisions, and actually by the stealth of night went off to see David. And when she found David, it says she bowed down before him and begged for mercy and gave him these provisions and said, please do not harm my master, even though he is a scoundrel. She called her own husband a scoundrel. This guy was a piece of work. I'll tell you, when your own wife doesn't like you, you know you're in trouble, right? And so she begs for mercy. And so it says David relented against attacking Nabal. And what ended up happening was Nabal heard it, he got sick, and 10 days later he was dead. And nobody ever lifted an arm against him. He was dead. And then if the story wasn't weird enough already, and it says, and so then David sent a proposal to Abigail and asked her to marry him. I mean, the guy needed another wife. He only had one, for goodness sakes. And so, I mean, it's a weird twist to the story. But anyway, he ends up marrying Abigail. The thing I don't want you to miss in this story is that Nabal was a man who was very rich. And because he was rich, he felt like it was his right to answer harshly. And he felt like it was his right to answer roughly. And he had the spirit of a rich man, whereas his wife actually had the spirit of the poor. The blessed are the poor in spirit. She ends up being spared, and he ends up getting taken out. When you look at our world today, every single one of you knows somebody like this. You've maybe had a boss like Nabal. You've maybe had somebody in your life in a place of power or authority or someone of wealth, and you have seen them speak harshly. In fact, maybe some of you in this room are that man, and you have at times spoken roughly. And you know, we live in this world that actually celebrates it. It's kind of bizarre when you think about it. If you turn on the television, you will see all kinds of people, rich people, insulting others. I mean, for example, if you watch Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, you see our Canadian Kevin O'Leary, and he tells people how useless and stupid their ideas are and how they wasted their time and their life and how the profit motive is the only thing important in this life, and he berates them and belittles them. Or if you watch X Factor or American Idol, you might see Simon Cowell, and we laugh at Simon because he has one insult after another, and he tells people they're horrible or terrible or pathetic, or they've invented a new form of torture. And we giggle and smile and laugh and say, oh, he's so mean. And then, of course, for years we watched Donald Trump, didn't we, on The Apprentice? And as he demeaned people and told them they weren't fit for business, and he pointed at them and said, you're fired. And then, of course, we all thought it was all theatrics until the man ran for president. And then we found out that, in fact, that's really who he was. And he became the first person in history to try to insult himself and insult his way to the presidency. And I mean, think of the things he said. I mean, they're kind of bizarre, the kinds of things he said. I mean, he has kicked reporters out of press conferences. He's told them to sit down, to shut up, and to get out. He's insulted people and told them they're crooked and they're liars and they're despicable and they're horrendous and they're horrible people. And he's called them fat and stupid and ugly. And there's people keeping track of his insults, and it's now at 300. He has 300 new and unique insults that he's got for people. And you know what? He has an explanation for why he feels free to say whatever he wants about anybody else. And you know what it is? I'm very, very rich, you know. You see, the one thing those three men all have in common is what? They're rich, and they have the spirit of the rich. They don't have the spirit of the poor man. They have the spirit of the rich man, and they answer harshly. And you see, I know you're thinking, why are you picking on Donald Trump? Aren't they ganging up enough on him? Yeah, you know what? I think he's deserved every little bit of it, don't you? I think he's brought it on himself. I don't feel sorry for him in the least, and neither should you. You know what? You reap what you sow. And when you sow that, you've got to expect it to come back. And I'm not talking about his politics. It's got nothing to do with it. I'm talking about the attitude of the rich man who's reminded us again and again and again how very, very rich he is. If he's got so much money, how come he can't get a decent haircut? That's what I want to know. Right? Turn to your hairdresser and say, you're fired. I want you to think about something for a moment. I know I'm poking a little fun here, but I want you to think about something. You see, if you are rich or if you're in a place of power or authority, that does not give you the right to put down other people. What it does is you actually have a higher responsibility, because Jesus said what? He said, to whom, finish it for me, to whom much is given what? Much is required. And when God blesses us with much, we have a responsibility to actually be better people, not worse. And here's where I'm going with this. I would love to say that this spirit has not infected the church, but it actually has. And I know there are people in this room, you're not only thinking about people you know like this, but you yourself have been like this. Every one of us have. Every one of us has had that moment where we lost sight of our spiritual bankruptcy. Instead, we became the spiritual rich man. I want to tell you a story that happened to me when I was an assistant pastor. I was just starting out in the ministry. And it was some 30-some years ago, and there I was this, fresh-faced young guy. And my pastor, he had a hero. And I'm not going to tell you who this was, but this guy was a world-renowned preacher, and he was his real hero. And a dream come true for him would be that someday he would be able to bring that pastor, that preacher, to Winnipeg and have him preach in his own church. And while I was there and in the employ of this church, it actually happened. And my pastor was so excited. He was so giddy about this. I mean, if you can try to relate to this, it'd be sort of like me being able to bring in Weird Al Yankovic. I mean, it's, sort of on the same par with that. And so anyway, so he brings him in. I remember we went down to the airport to pick him up, and this preacher had arrived in his personal Learjet. And I sat in the back seat riding to the hotel with the pilot. And the pilot was explaining to me how they just had the engines refitted at a cost of $1 million per engine. There's 2 engines. I mean, here I am. I'm 26 years old, sitting in the back seat. I'm an assistant pastor making $10,000 a year. I have no frame of reference for $1 million refit on your engine. But anyway, so we get to the hotel. We put them up somewhere nice. They were in the Fork Area Hotel. We got them a beautiful suite. And so we were getting them settled into their rooms. We were standing in the hall. They were just about to go to their rooms. And then this preacher, he turned to my pastor and he said this. He said, tonight at the meeting, you will take 2 offerings, one for yourself and one for me. And my pastor said, well, that wasn't my plan. What I was going to do tonight was just going to, we don't need an offering. I was just going to take an offering for you. And then this man pointed at him and said, no, I said you will take 2 offerings, one for yourself and one for me. And he said it very abruptly. And my pastor was sort of stunned for a moment. And then he said, I'll be taking 2 offerings tonight, one for myself and one for you. And the man said, you are a wise man. He turned on his heel and went through the door and slammed it in our faces. And as we were standing there, I could see the embarrassment on my pastor's face that he'd just been humiliated in front of his young protege, for one thing. But worse yet, I could see that the shine of this man's armor had just taken on a little bit of tarnish. And I remember that moment. I remember seeing how he treated this man, and I thought, I never want to be like that. In fact, when they left 2 days later and that jet flew off, I thought, you know what? If I never see them again, that will be too soon. And I thought, you know, he was one man in public and another man in private, and he had the spirit of a rich man, and he acted like it, and he talked like it, and he treated other people like it. And I remember making a vow that day, and I thought, I don't ever want to end up like that. So then life goes on. 15 years later, we're moving and grooving in Church of the Rock. We're here in the city, and we're probably in our greatest growth spurt we've ever had. And the church is actually busting out at the seams. And we were over on Pembina Highway where the Shoppers Drug Mart is, and that was our building. And we went from 1 service to 2 services to triple services. And then we were doing 4 services on a Sunday. We started at 8:15 in the morning. We went to 8:15 at night. It was a ridiculous season for us, I'll tell you. You know, I mean, I can get through 3 sermons. By the time I'm preaching 4, I can't even take myself seriously anymore. You know, when I'm preaching the first time, you know, I'm all passionate and meaningful. By the time I get to the 4th sermon, something comes out of my mouth and I crack up. It seemed hilarious to me. And so people would come back. They say, oh, you got to come on Sunday night. You got to come back. By the time Pastor Mark's on the 4th sermon, he completely loses it. The guy's completely punch drunk up there. He practically is incoherent. You got to hear it. And people were coming out on Sunday night to hear me lose it. And I would be laughing, and they would be laughing, and I never ever got through a sermon, never on Sunday night. And the Sunday night crowd just kept on growing and growing because of my incompetence, it turned out. Anyway, let me tell you what was happening. We didn't have enough parking. We had this little triangular lot. Some of you have been in it. Holds about 30 cars. And so I went over next door to the Canadian Tire and I made a deal with the manager. They opened at noon and I said, do you think you would let us use your parking lot in the morning before your customers come, and then we'll clear out, and then, you know, there's a good chance some of these people come shop at your store. And so he agreed to that, sort of reluctantly, but he agreed to that. Well, by the time we got into our 12-hour days of services all day long, guess where people were parking? They were parking in Canadian Tire all day long. They were parking in the lot. So this manager got upset with it, and he started tagging cars and threatening to tow them away if they were parked there after 11:30, like the rule was. So I decided that I was going to go over and talk to him and use some of my considerable charm. Now, unfortunately, I picked Monday morning to do it. After my punch-drunk Sunday night and after 12-hour days of preaching, and I'm not at my best on Monday morning. Actually, any morning for that matter, but on Monday morning in particular, not at my best. So I went over there, and I went into his office, and I asked him, I said, you know, is there some way we can work this out? I can't stop people from parking here. I don't really want you to tow them away. And he just sort of abruptly said, look, it's my parking lot. I can do what I like with it. And then all of a sudden, I lost it. And I lit into him. And I raked him. And I said, you don't know a thing about business, do you? I said, if you want to appeal to your constituency, the very people that live in the region that you're trying to reach, you want to actually appeal to them, and you're doing the opposite. What do you know about PR and public relations and business? Did they teach you nothing? And I went on this guy. I went up one side and down the other side, and I absolutely raked him and told him he was a complete loser, and turned on my heel and walked out the door. I wasn't 10 feet away from the door, and I realized what I had done. I had not burned the bridge. I had exploded it. Boom! So long, sucker. No, so long me. What I had done. But see, it wasn't so much what I had done that concerned me. What concerned me is what I had become. And I thought, what did I just do? I wasn't 10 feet past the door. And I started to be so disappointed at who I'd become. And maybe some of the success we had gone to my head. Who knows? Maybe I was tired. It doesn't matter. I did it. And I was so ashamed of myself. And I remembered that vow I had made some 15, 20 years earlier that I did not want to become that person. And I had become that person. The next day I returned to Canadian Tire. And I got in to see him. And I apologized to him. And I literally begged for mercy. And I said, I was so out of line. And I apologize, and you know, I have no real excuse to say that I was just wrong, and I just need you to forgive me. Anyway, he forgave me. He was a big enough man to forgive me. Wasn't a big enough man to give us the parking, no. Nothing changed. But see, that didn't matter. That wasn't the point. It wasn't a matter whether I got my way or not. What mattered is who had I become. And so I thought, I never want to do that again. I'd made a vow I wasn't going to be that person. So this time I prayed, and I said, Lord, you need to help me. You need to help me not become that person. You need to supernaturally intervene. That was my prayer. I should have never prayed that. God has been intervening for the last 15 years. And every time there's any moment of success, he brings me back down to size. You know, if you will not humble yourself, he is not afraid to humiliate you. And he will usually do it in public. You know what's interesting is many times it's sort of humorous how he does it. And I always think, oh, God, at work. I'll tell you one quick story about this. Me and the boys, Derek and some of those guys, we go on the road every year, and we go to other cities, and we do what I call our dog and pony show. And we do some of the theme stuff that we do around here. We dress up in costumes. And this particular time, we were on our Western tour, and we were doing a Motown thing. We were dressed in silver tuxedos with bow ties, and you can't beat that look, really. And so we were doing it, and our Calgary church that we were meeting at meets in the Eau Claire Cinema. It's downtown. There's a cinema there, a movie theater, and we meet in the movie theater. And so we went and we did our Motown show, and I preached, and so we had this great event. And this is what happens, and I say this really in all humility. When I travel, people think for some reason I'm hot stuff. And I will get out of one of these meetings, and I will have a lineup of 100 or sometimes 200 people that want to meet me, shake my hand, touch me, get my autograph, take a selfie with me. It's like ridiculous. And while this is going on, this is what I do. I smile and remind myself, this is not real. This is not really happening. And in a few hours, I'm going to go back home, and my children and my congregation will continue to treat me like dirt. And I just remember that that's reality. And I try to keep my head screwed on straight. And so I am doing this, and it's probably went on for half an hour, and I'm shaking hands, and I'm, kissing women and slapping babies, or however that goes. I sometimes get that mixed up. But anyway, I'm doing all of that stuff. And it's all done, and I look, and there's one woman standing there. There's only one woman left, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm right at the end of the line. Fantastic. So I go over to her, and I say, so have you been waiting long? And she says, no, not too long. And I said, have you been here before? She says, oh, yes, I come often. I said, do you enjoy it? And she says, oh, yeah, it's part of my weekly routine. I said, that's fantastic. And then, of course, remember, we did the Motown show, so I said to her these words. I said, so did you enjoy the show? She says, well, I haven't even been yet. I said, excuse me? She says, my movie doesn't start till 12:15. This woman was minding her own business, standing in line to go to the movie, waiting for us to get out. And I, in a silver tuxedo, walk over to her and ask her how her day's going. I am pretty sure that she thought I was probably the theater usher, so I got her some popcorn. And then I reminded myself this, that when you start greeting complete strangers that don't know who you are, like you're some sort of celebrity, you've probably overstayed your welcome. And you know what? It's just for me a bit of a reminder that God is always keeping us, and he will always bring you to that place where you need to recognize that you are to be the poor in spirit. For blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. One of the things that the scholars say about the Beatitudes, that they're actually written in a progression, and that each one of these Beatitudes is like a ladder going from one step to the other, and this is the first rung. You need to start at this rung. And if you don't get blessed are the poor in spirit, you're not going to get any of the rest of it. And so I thought that was sort of interesting, and I stumbled on this thing, and I'll show you on the screen here, called the Ladder of Divine Ascent. And this was actually originally not a painting. It was originally a poem that was written in the 6th century by an Eastern Orthodox monk. And he was talking in his poem about the ascent to heaven, the monastic life, and how in order to move towards heaven, you would have to begin to imbibe in certain virtues of God and lay aside certain things. And I love the picture that got drawn. This was actually not drawn till the 12th century, and this artist depicted it. And it shows these monks literally falling off the ladder before they reach the top. And you see the work of demons trying to pull them and drag them down, which is very much true of our Christian life. As we try to move through and as we try to ascend to heaven, we have a lot of opposition against us. And so it was depicted here, and this particular painting is in St. Catherine's Monastery, which is the oldest monastery in the world, Christian monastery in the world, and it's here at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt, or at least what they say is Mount Sinai. And some of the rarest Christian artwork is actually in this monastery, and you can go and you can tour, and you can look at this artwork, including the ladder of divine ascent. And I say all this to say this. Do you know what the very first rung is in the ladder of divine ascent? It's the renunciation of the world. The first rung is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. It all starts there. It all starts with this fact that we need to recognize that we are spiritually bankrupt, that we are destitute without God. We are in desperate need of Him, and there is nothing, we have no power or no defenses against suffering and death and eternal damnation, and the only thing we can do is throw ourselves at the mercy of God. And if we can't get to that place where we recognize that we are spiritually broken, we can never begin this journey to really attaining everything that God's got for us. You know, it's interesting because Jesus told a story about this. And it was the story in Luke chapter 18 about two men who went up to the temple to pray. Do you remember this story? And one was a Pharisee and the other one was a tax collector. And it says the Pharisee said this. It says the Pharisee prayed thus to himself. You know, when you're praying to yourself, you're probably already in trouble. But he prayed thus to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, like extortioners or unjust or adulterers. And then he pointed, he said, or that tax collector over there. I'm glad I'm not like him. And then it says, and the tax collector, he knelt down and he didn't even lift up his eyes to heaven. And he beat his breast and he said, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus said this, most assuredly I say to you, that man went down to his house justified, not the other. Now here's the thing I don't want you to miss about this story. Both of these men were rich men. The Pharisee and the tax collector both would have been wealthy in their day, but the difference between those two men was one had the spirit of the rich man and one had the spirit of the poor man. And Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You know, it's interesting because Luke actually tells the Beatitudes in his gospel, but he tells them a little different. And he words it this way. He says, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And then he says this, and woe to the rich. He gives the other side of it. He says, woe to the rich, for you already have your consolation. What was he saying? He's saying, woe to the rich, you already have your reward. You see, what happens in life is that when people are wealthy, they don't think they need God, do they? They've already got their reward. If they need something, they can buy it. They have the money, and they answer roughly and harshly, and they live this life of self-reliance and self-dependence because they don't need God and they don't need anybody else because they have the money and the wherewithal to buy it. And that's why Paul says this, not many wise, not many noble, not many mighty will enter the kingdom of God. Not because they're rich and mighty and noble, because they do not have the attitude of the Beatitudes. They do not have the spirit of the poor man. Let me close with one final story here today. I'm going to ask you this question. On August 31st, 1997, a woman passed away. Who was it? Anybody know? Diana. Princess Diana died on this day. And the world, here was this 36-year-old princess who had been actually shunned by her husband, Prince Charles, as he went off to chase his mistress. And she became the darling of the media. And at a ripe young age of 36 years old, she's tragically killed. Well, the grief was unprecedented. I mean, people's outpouring of emotions over this. They came to Kensington Palace where she lived by the thousands and thousands of people, and they laid flowers, so much so that you couldn't even get anywhere near the palace after a few days. It was really a grief that covered the entire world. The news media was completely preoccupied by this as they were preparing for the funeral at Westminster Abbey. But then just 6 days after her death, before the funeral, another woman died. Who remembers who that was? Mother Teresa of Calcutta died in that same week. And all of a sudden, people didn't know what to do. Well, I mean, imagine how inconsiderate and rude it was of Mother Teresa to die when we're busy grieving the princess. And I mean, I know I'm saying that sarcastically, but that was sort of what was going on. And the news media didn't know what to do with it because they were so captured with this, with the death of Princess Di, that the death of Mother Teresa got a footnote. And then the inevitable comparisons started to come out, and there was Saint Teresa and Saint Diana. Really? Seriously? One of them lived in palaces, drove around in chauffeur-driven limousines, wore designer outfits, and was having an affair with an Arab billionaire. The other lived in the streets of Calcutta, wore the garb of the lowest caste in all of India, and worked amongst the poorest of poor every day of her life. The comparison was not really a fair comparison. And what's interesting is the two actually knew each other. I mean, they had met. If you look at the pictures here, they had met. And I mean, it's a stark contrast between these two women, right? In stature and in glamour and everything else. I love this next picture as it shows the humility of Mother Teresa as she bows her head and folds her hands like she's in prayer. She understands that she is in the presence of a princess, and she has the spirit of the poor, this little wrinkled woman side by side with this glamorous princess. As I said, the media didn't know what to do with it, and they really didn't give much credit and really much time to the story of the death of Mother Teresa. See, Mother Teresa was arguably the most influential female of the 20th century. And I think if she had died apart from the death of Diana, news would have gone on for weeks and weeks. And I remember when it happened, and I couldn't help but think this. I thought, this is a setup. God planned this whole thing. It's just like God to do this, take this woman who wanted to work in anonymity her entire life and allowed her to die in anonymity. She wouldn't have wanted all of that fanfare. And the contrast between these two, if we're really looking, and I'm not commenting on Princess Di's eternal salvation, because I don't know, I'm not making a judgment on that at all. I'm making a comment on the death of these two women. On the one side, the world was beyond consolation because a 36-year-old princess had died, and everything that she had, her whole world came crashing down. But on the other side of the equation, there was no sadness for the death of Mother Teresa. How could there be? She was 87 years old. She had lived her life with an incredible purpose and gone on. And when she gets to heaven, I can promise you this, when you're walking the streets of heaven, you're going to see Mother Teresa's mansion, and it's going to make Buckingham Palace look like a shed. And she's going to live in this glory because the scripture says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. See, this is what you need to understand. Everything that we can obtain in this world, none of it matters. None of it's important. And you might spend your entire life working towards it, but big deal. At the end of the day, it's not going to amount for anything. And the only thing that's going to matter for anything is the glory that we're going to have in heaven. And that's why the scripture says to die in Christ is actually joy. And that's why Jesus says, happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Let's stand together, shall we?